All right, I think we're going to get started. Good morning and welcome. I'm Lara Friedman. I am the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today looking at annexation and what it means, Palestinian perspectives. This webinar is part 2 of a 3-part series co-organized with the Middle East Institute and co-moderated by myself and Khaled El-Gindi, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute. Some quick context for our webinars. Under the agreement governing the new Israeli government, formal annexation can be advanced as early as July 1st. For its part, the US, of course, is deeply involved in planning and mapping that annexation, and Secretary of State Pompeo was in Israel yesterday. Lots of chatter is out there about how and if and when and whether. We're not going to be talking about that. What we're talking about here in this webinar today in this series is the impact of annexation, what it means in practice for various stakeholders and from various perspectives. Part 1 was on the international, the US, Europe, and Arab state perspective. You can watch that video on the MEI or FMEP website. Today is the Palestinians, and on Monday, we'll be looking at Israeli perspectives. Over to you, Khaled. You're muted, Khaled, you're muted.
That had to happen. Thanks, Laura. To help us shed light on this very compelling topic, we have a really stellar panel of experts in Palestine. I'll go over the list briefly, but you can check out their full bios on both the MEI and FMEP websites dedicated to today's event. So going in alphabetical order, we have first Salim Barahma, the Executive Director of the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy. And second, we have Yara Yara, the Senior Palestine Policy Fellow at Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. And last, but certainly not least, we have Rania Moharib, a legal researcher and advocacy officer with the Palestinian human rights organization, Al-Haq. The format for today will be a moderator-led discussion with our panelists. In addition to our questions, we welcome questions from all of you, our audience, which you can submit in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the panel, and we'll keep an eye on those and try to incorporate as many of those as we can into the discussion as we go. Please also note that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online immediately after it ends. Finally, if you have any technical issues, please let us know using the chat function. So the chat is for technical issues and the Q&A is to actually pose questions, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will also be putting into the chat box the Twitter handles and websites of all of our panelists. If you want to continue to hear from them, you can follow them on social media. And you probably should do that since we have such a great panel. So with that, let's go ahead and begin.
Yes, I remembered to unmute myself this time. All right, so we're going to get started. This is going to go in several rounds. In this first round, so as has already been noted, today is Nakba Day. And I want to use this first round to ask our panelists to help us understand the context in which Palestinians understand this whole idea of annexation. So I'm going to start off with Yara. Yara, can you talk about this history, basically every Palestinian story of loss and exile in 1948, 1967, which is the Nakba, and how this history shapes the way Palestinians living in Palestine on both sides of the Green Line see the prospect of Israeli formal annexation of West Bank land today?
Yeah, Laura and Khaled, thanks for hosting us. And I think it is very important to mention that today is the day in which Palestinians commemorate the Nakba, not just as a historical event, but also the 72 years of ongoing erasure. And whilst it's something that's both poignant and empowering, and I think it's poignant because we remember how our society was shattered in 1948 and how it continues to be dispersed. and our people continue to be imprisoned and killed and our lands stolen from us. But it's also empowering because we've survived this ethnic cleansing. And despite the exile of more than half of our people, we still have a presence on the land. So Israel formally annexing yet more of Palestinian land doesn't really change any of this. It really confirms what Palestinians have been saying since 1948, which is that this is an ongoing project. The Nakba is not simply a historical event, something that happened 72 years ago. It's a continuous settler colonial project of erasure. And I think it's also probably pertinent here to mention what we mean when we're talking about annexation. We're talking about formal annexation. It's a legal term, and it refers to the forced acquisition of territory, and when sovereignty is applied to that territory. And my colleague Rania will go more into the legal details, I'm sure. But I think it's important to remember what annexation means in non-legal terms as well, and the manifestations on the ground. And that's the theft of land, the total control over it and its resources, the displacement of large swaths of indigenous people. And in Palestine, this initially happened in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel on top of it, and then later with the occupation of the 1967 territories and the de facto annexation. So I think it's important to remember that, remember the context of the Nakba as a continuing one, and that annexation hasn't just come out of thin air. It's actually part of a process of Israeli settler colonial expansionism.
Thank you. That's so good. So Rania, following up on Yara's comments, set this up perfectly. Can you explain a legal perspective? First of all, I want to talk about what happened in 48 and in 67, the loss of land and homes, exile, with international law basically failing to provide meaningful recourse or remedy. How does that frame the current discussion around annexation for Palestinians today?
So much, Lara, and hello to everyone. Good morning, afternoon, wherever you are. I really think that it's fitting that we're having this discussion on Nakba Day, and I really endorse what Yara has just said in her opening remarks. For us, definitely the Nakba is an ongoing process, a continuous process of loss of land, displacement and dispossession of Palestinians. But one of the points that when we talk about legality that is often left out is the legality of the events that really reshaped the history of Palestine. And when we talk even about the Nakba in 1948, at the time already we know that the acquisition of territory by force was illegal under international law, and it was already prohibited by the UN Charter of 1945. So specifically the Charter under Article 2.4 actually already prohibited the use of force and acquisition of territory by force, which were formally outlawed after the Second World War. The second point we have to remember is that international law already recognized at the time a right of self-determination for the Palestinian people. And in fact, it had already been recognized by the Covenant of the League of Nations, which talked about a so-called sacred trust of civilizations. And it talked about the fact that peoples under colonial and mandatory rule already have a right of self-determination to freely decide their own destiny. And actually, in fact, even at the time, Palestine was considered a Class A mandate, and therefore provisionally its independence was recognized. The last thing that I do want to highlight is that we know that the massacres of Palestinians, the extensive destruction of property, and the forcible transfer and the mass expulsion of Palestinians during the Nakba already constituted violations of the laws and customs of war at the time. And actually, they had even been tried as international crimes 3 years prior at the International Military Tribunal for Nuremberg. Therefore, they had already been recognized as international crimes, which required prosecution. Yet in the context of Palestinians, no one has ever been held accountable for crimes committed against Palestinians. The crimes of the Nakba were never tried, and no other crimes committed since then have been tried or held accountable. And this impunity really continued in 67 with the occupation, and of course also again the expulsion of Palestinian refugees, and then the annexation, of course, of East Jerusalem and the occupied Syrian Golan. At the time, the Security Council said that acquisition of territory by force was illegal again, also saying that Israel should withdraw from these territories, and that never happened. And then in the 1980s, Israel extended its sovereignty through its own basic laws to the occupied Syrian Golan and to occupied East Jerusalem. That too is regarded as null and void by the international community, and yet it was carried out, and it hasn't been reversed ever since. So the fact is that further annexation right now is only a continuation of this policy of impunity that we've seen since 1948. The fact is that acquisition of territory by force was already illegal back then, and it still is illegal today. And the question right now is, how long will Israel's impunity continue to be tolerated, in fact?
Thank you so much. So moving on to Salim. So Salim, the Oslo process, I mean, I came of age with this issue with Oslo. The Oslo process was predicated on the idea that the 1948 file was closed and that there would be lasting peace based on the Palestinians realizing self-determination exclusively in territories occupied after 1967. Now, you and your fellow panelists, who all make me feel very old, are all part of a generation that came of age long after the Oslo process had not only failed, but had been repurposed into what I think Khaled and I wrote about this sort of shackling that prevents the Palestinians from pursuing rights via any other means. In this context, can you talk about how Palestinians today, especially post-Oslo generations, view annexation? For example, do they see it, as Palestinian officials might frame it, as the end of the two-state solution? Or do they see it maybe as just further evidence that the way forward has to be something other than two states or by some other process?
Thanks, Lara, and thanks, Khaled, and hello everyone that's joined us today. I think the people who are shocked and horrified by the chatter around annexation are actually capitals around the world. And I think for a lot of Palestinians who've lived in Palestine for a very long time, this is not something new. I think we've lived de facto annexation and forms of annexation since we were born. And so, as part of the Oslo generation and the post-Oslo generation, we were the generation that were promised a state under this paradigm, but instead we saw land theft, we saw settlement construction, and we saw a PA that essentially controls 18% of the West Bank. That's the only area in the West Bank that's under full PA control. The rest of it is under Israeli control. And so Israel also extends its civilian law, its Knesset law, to settlements all over the West Bank. So when a parliament is able to extend that form of law into occupied territory, doesn't that also account to some form of annexation already? So actually, a formal de jure annexation is not us crossing the Rubicon. The Rubicon was crossed many, many years ago. And by a lot of capitals around the world refraining from analyzing the situation for what it is on the ground and still pursuing a paradigm that no longer exists and is more akin to 1993 than 2020, it's shackled our ability to have a conversation about where we want to go in the future. And it's entrenched this paradigm, which only serves, I think, as a vehicle now for the vision of Greater Israel. And that's what formal annexation is, essentially, we're moving along that spectrum, and now it's getting the endorsement of the Trump administration, right? And so, for us, the idea of the Oslo paradigm, two states within the Oslo paradigm, died a long time ago. And so for us to be able to have a constructive conversation with the world, I think the world needs to acknowledge that and accept the reality for what it is, their failure to hold Israel accountable, and start pursuing policies that are able to, I think, uphold Palestinian freedom and rights. And that includes the right of return, which I think is something we need to, I think, hold up even more today than any other day. And the last point I want to make is, we had a litmus test for annexation, and that was in the early 80s when Israel annexed East Jerusalem, and the world did nothing. And Israel realized it could get away with that. And if you take away Jerusalem as the heart of the Oslo process and the Oslo paradigm, I mean, what else would we have had left then already? So I think that's the way a lot of us see it, and it's deeply frustrating. And I think it's time for us to start looking forward.
Thank you.
Great. I want to take the discussion a little bit deeper, and Salam, I want to stay with you for a minute. Based on the point that you just made, that essentially we've had, annexation is not a moment, but it's been an ongoing, it's sort of like the Nakba, it's been an ongoing process, even throughout what we used to call the peace process, in terms of, de facto annexation. But does it, the question I have is there some qualitative difference, or is it simply more of the same? I mean, does the situation change in a legal sense, in a political sense, the day after formal annexation, or even in a psychological sense, or is it simply a non-event in your view?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Khaled. Let me start by saying I'm from Jericho. I'm currently in Jericho. I'm speaking to you from here. So in Jericho's in the Jordan Valley. And the Jordan Valley was the area that was, the talk of the Israeli election about the area that was to be annexed. And if you go to anyone in Jericho and ask them, how do you feel about imminent Israeli annexation? They look at you slightly confused and say, I thought that already happened. I thought we were already annexed. I think for a lot of Palestinians in the Jordan Valley, they already can't access their land. That land is already, belonging to Jewish Israeli settlements that are able to farm it, live in it, and have thrived in it. And we see our land that has been taken, and land that we cannot access anymore. And so that for us is the reality already, and has been for a very long time. So in terms of what it changes on the ground, to be honest, I don't see much. I think it's part of the global political theatrics and potentially legal mechanisms of accountability that different sides might access. But I don't see how life is going to change. At the moment, as I was saying earlier, we live in a one-state reality already, where Israel already controls all the land between the river and the sea. And so your rights, your freedoms are afforded to you based on your ethnicity. Right. And so if you're Jewish Israeli, you get a certain, you get full freedom and rights. And if you're Palestinian, there are 4 tiers of rights and freedoms that you get. And so we're already under different forms of Israeli legal systems, whether they're civilian that hold you unequal, or military that hold you unfree and equal. And so, yeah, I don't see what's going to change. And I think the continuum of the pursuit of the vision of Greater Israel is just going to get the green light from different capitals around the world, and that's mainly Washington, D.C. And I'll end with one last point. For people who don't know, it wasn't Likud that built the settlements around Jericho in the 1970s. It was the Labor government. And this shows the nature of the system. It's not attached to a specific politician or coalition government or party. This is very much part of a systematic regime that has been pursuing land theft since its inception. And so if you look at where Israeli society is today, I mean, which party still supports the two-state solution? Maybe Meretz and the Joint List. Every other Jewish Israeli dominant party is fully in support of controlling all the land between the river and the sea. And that's not going to change the reality on the ground.
Thanks, Salam. I wanted to turn now to Yara. Obviously, when we talk about annexation, we end up talking a lot about what Israel does and doesn't do. But as we know, there is another actor in the region, in the very country where you are now, that has also had a role for more than a quarter century now. That is the Palestinian Authority. Can you talk to us about the role that the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian leadership in general, has played in getting us to this point? And if you could also address what you see as their response to annexation, in terms of de jure annexation that is expected sometime in the next few months. What has been their official response, or what is likely to be their response? And do you see that as effective?
Yeah, thanks, Khaled, for your question. And you are right. The There are many to blame for this situation, for this vulnerable situation that Palestinians find themselves in, mainly, of course, Israel and the third-party states have failed to uphold international law. But I think as Palestinians, we also have to be self-reflective and look at the leadership which claims to represent us. Of course, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which has been overshadowed by the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which is supposed to be the interim governing body of Areas A. And I make that distinction for a reason, because people often use the two interchangeably, the PA and the PLO, and they aren't the same thing. The PLO is the representative body still recognized by many Palestinians around the world as their legitimate body that represents them, whilst the PA, doesn't really represent much outside of Areas A. And I think here it's perhaps important to go back to Oslo and to think about how this situation was all laid out and how the foundations for the situation we're in was laid out much before Oslo, but for the purpose of perhaps for the purpose of being succinct in timing, we'll stick to Oslo as a sort of a point in time. Edward Said called it a Palestinian Versailles, a great theatre of Palestinian capitulation, basically. And he said this because the PLO was so deeply unprepared. He commented that the leadership, had never seen a settlement because, of course, they lived in exile and they had never seen settlements with their own eyes. And so, when they came back here, when they came back to Palestine, they were completely shocked. Now, having said that, and there is a lot of valid critique of them, we have to ask ourselves if they'd been more prepared, would it have helped? And I'm not sure. The power balance was so not in favor of the Palestinians. And at the time, the PLO, their priority was to get the exiled leadership back to Palestinian soil. And we can all say with hindsight that there were so many mistakes made, and particularly how it laid the foundations for the fragmentation of the West Bank through Areas A, B, and C, how it basically gave all the natural resources to the areas that Israel would control. There was complete short-sightedness when it came to economic agreements, how the Palestinian economy was intrinsically linked with the Israeli economy through the Paris Protocol, the creation of a donor-reliant civil society, the depoliticization of that society and the Palestinian struggle. And we can also look to what the Palestinian Authority has done since its creation after Oslo, the security coordination, which is an incredibly unpopular policy, which facilitates the sharing of information between the PA and the Israelis, which leads often to the arrest of activists and sometimes the assassination of Palestinian activists, the abandonment of refugees, corruption, the prioritization of the private and banking sector over ordinary working people. And we've actually seen that really play out during Corona. We've seen that the Palestinian Authority has really had its priorities set on making sure that on mitigating the effects on the private sector and the banking sector, which of course so many other regimes around the world have done this. So all of this is to say that the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian Authority has had a hand in getting us to where we are, which is one of the most vulnerable situations we have been. And the PA strategy today is an incredibly poor one. They are simply relying on international law and hoping and praying that third states will do something when it's been quite clear throughout history, throughout many decades, that there isn't a red line. And they've been putting all their eggs into one basket, and unfortunately, it's simply not good enough.
Turning now to Rania. Rania, you work for an organization that is well known and is probably Palestine's premier human rights and organizations working for justice for Palestinians under international law. From your vantage point, can you lay out for us what annexation would change from a legal standpoint? Does it trigger any sort of international mechanism? What principles of international law does it violate that weren't already being violated, and so forth? And how will your work at Al-Haq change as a result?
Of course, thanks, Khaled. And I really do have to, just echo what Salim was saying earlier, because for us as Palestinians, annexation has been a reality for a very long time already. And so maybe if I can start with what annexation won't change, because there are many things that will stay the way they already are right now. One of them is the fact that when we talk about Area C, for example, Israel already controls the land and natural resources in Area C, including water resources. Palestinians already don't have access to most of the land in Area C, which is designated, for example, as closed military zones, firing zones, or exclusively reserved for Israeli settlements. So the fact is that Palestinians already don't have access to many parts of Area C, and they don't have control or sovereignty over natural resources in Area C. One example is the Palestinian Bedouin and herding communities, which have for years been deprived of their means of subsistence, their livelihoods, by increased loss of land, for example, for grazing of their livestock, but also water for other basic necessities. So the fact is that forcible transfer has been ongoing for years, and that already is illegal under international law. There actually is even a statement by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court from 2 years ago, which said in the case of Khan al-Ahmad that forcible transfer and extensive destruction of property in occupied territory would constitute a war crime, and therefore would be liable for prosecution. Looking now at maybe what would change if annexation becomes formalized in parts of Area C or the entirety of Area C, I think that we don't need to look far to know what it would look like, because we already have two precedents with the case of Jerusalem and the case of the occupied Syrian Golan. So maybe the first element would be Israeli civil law, as Salim was saying, already applies in the settlements, but it would be directly applied on Palestinians in the Jordan Valley and in Area C more generally. This is obviously prohibited under international humanitarian law, which prohibits the occupying power from making any changes to the situation in the occupied territory, including applying its own domestic legislation to that territory. Another change that we might see is the application of residency or permanent residency law on Palestinians. So this is something that's already the case in Jerusalem and in the occupied Syrian Golan. But finally, I think that the most important part is going to be that we're going to continue to see displacement of Palestinians, dispossession of Palestinians, and exploitation of their natural resources. And that obviously would affect the work that Al-Haq does on the ground, because Al-Haq is a human rights organization monitoring and documenting violations. So we obviously have field researchers in different parts of the West Bank, including in the Jordan Valley. I think the further annexation would likely cause further movement and access restrictions that would cause difficulties in actually documenting violations on the ground. But in terms of our advocacy work, it really will stay the same. Because at the end of the day, we are dealing with, as both co-panelists were saying, we're dealing with a situation of institutionalized oppression over Palestinians, and that is not going to change whether annexation becomes formal, de jure, or whether it continues to be de facto as it is right now. A final point maybe, because you also mentioned tools, legal tools at our disposal when it comes to preventing or facing or challenging annexation. Obviously, third states already have these obligations under international law. They don't in fact change. They have three obligations: not to recognize a situation of annexation as legal, like Jerusalem and the Syrian Golan, but also not to aid or assist in maintaining that situation, for example, through their own corporations. And last, to actually cooperate to bring it to an end, which is an obligation that states actually have never taken when it came to Israeli policies against Palestinians.
Thank you. So Rania, I actually want to pick up exactly where you left off. So from the perspective of Palestinian human rights defenders, we have had now since 48 and 67, the international community has, as you guys have all laid out, consistently failed to hold Israel accountable for its actions vis-a-vis the Palestinians, particularly since 67 with the de facto annexation and dispossession, all that we've seen. Do you see this changing with annexation? And we have a question in the box from Blake Selzer. Do you think the international community, which is now making some noises about seeking consequences or trying to challenge impunity, do you think it can be taken seriously given its complete failure to do so up until this point?
Right. I mean, I think obviously I completely agree about the part of the international community having really failed to uphold Palestinian rights and to put an end to situations of illegality, such as previous annexations and ongoing annexations of Jerusalem and the Syrian Golan. But I think that it's far more than a failure to act. It's actually a systematic effort to shield Israel from accountability. This is really what we've been seeing for decades as human rights organizations and defenders. We've seen really that there has been no effort to impose, for example, sanctions on Israel, even though that has been the case in other contexts of systematic abuse. Third states, for example, haven't even banned trade with settlements that they themselves regard as illegal. And there actually is only one country in the world that is taking legislative measures to ban trade with settlements at the moment, and that's Ireland. But in fact, all countries should be doing the same thing, and they haven't done that to date. But then we also see within different mechanisms, including the UN and the International Criminal Court, that actual measures to hold Israel accountable are being deliberately prevented. At the Human Rights Council, we're talking about measures to remove item 7, which is on Palestine and occupied Arab territories, from the agenda of the council to further silence voices talking about Palestinian rights abuses. But we also see that the council has had countless commissions of inquiry, fact-finding missions on Palestine, that since the year 2000 at least, there have been 10 UN investigatory mechanisms. Not one recommendation of any of these commissions of inquiry or fact-finding missions has ever been implemented when it comes to Palestine. And that really talks to this institutionalized impunity that we're talking about. Another example at the UN is the UN database of businesses operating in Israeli settlements, which for years has been delayed from publication by states deliberately so that corporations would not be held accountable for their complicity and involvement in settlement enterprise. But then we also talk about the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court right now is facing extreme pressure from states so that it does not open an investigation into the situation in Palestine. And that also really speaks to the situation of impunity. So if I would really highlight that, that's really what I would like to talk about, because I think the international community has really contributed to Israel, to the continued violations that we see on the ground, and that they actually have tacitly endorsed them. And they certainly have not taken any measures to really put an end to them. And maybe the reason for that is because they themselves have corporations, for example, that are complicit in this enterprise, and that they're unwilling to hold accountable. The other thing is that they also have been unwilling to really address the root causes of Palestinians' rights abuses when it comes to the right of return of Palestinian refugees or overall Palestinian self-determination. There really haven't been any measures that were really taken. So I think that if the question is what we're going to see with an upcoming annexation, I don't think that it will be very different from what we've already seen so far. It will resemble very closely what happened with Jerusalem and the occupied Syrian Golan. And at best, what we're going to see is states not recognizing the legality of that annexation, but actually not taking measures to put an end to it.
Thank you. And that's a hugely important point, the distinction between just passively not meeting obligations and actively, in effect, being complicit in enabling and in some ways accelerating the forces that have gotten us to where we are today of the international community. So turning to Salem. Salem, pundits and analysts, including people like me, often talk about the Palestinian Street. I want you to first talk about what that term means to you when you hear it. But I also want you then to, as someone who is active on the ground, you recently did a tour for the international community, a webinar tour of Palestine. I mean, you're out there. What is the temperature of the Palestinian Street today? And what do you think the popular reaction will be if Israel goes ahead with annexation? And I want to tie this into two questions that are in the box, in the Q&A box. One is this question about what is needed to turn Israeli annexation into sort of maybe to generate support for the future of a shared state, equal rights, getting that agenda sort of off the ground, which we've heard activists talk about for a long time. And the question of really what it will take to shift the thinking of Palestinian leadership, right? Because today the Palestinian leadership is still, as far as when I last heard them earlier this week, still very much focused on the two-state paradigm. How does that align with the Palestinian Street, and how do you see that maybe changing if annexation happens?
Thanks, Laura. I think the term Palestinian Street is on par with Thomas Friedman's anecdotes from taxi drivers around the Middle East. I'm not a big fan of the term. Palestinian society is not homogeneous. And so it's quite diverse. And we're 13 million all over the world. We have different views, political views, backgrounds. And so with that, comes I think a different set of reactions. But one thing that is, I think, let's look at some of the data. So Palestinian society is majority under 30, like well under 30. And there's a hierarchy of frustrations, right? There's number one, obviously, the Israeli oppression, discrimination, displacement, and injustice. Second is, I think, frustration and almost apathy for the lack of a political vision of where we're going and how do we get there in a political system that we can engage, win, and participate and shape that conversation. Third, I think economic, there's a lot of frustration. We have high unemployment rates. And so within that context, we've seen where Oslo has kind of taken us and hasn't really delivered on what it promised. And so there's almost a separation, a removal from any of this, I think, the international political theatrics, right? I think we grew up on statements of condemnation from the EU and the US, and never was action from anywhere in the world proportional to what Israel was doing on the ground, right? And that's the main issue. And we can see that. And so for us, realizing and knowing that nothing in our daily lives is going to change, I don't think people care that much about this, right? I think people will start caring when there is an inclusive system that is able to represent them, they are able to participate in, they're able to shape a new vision for where we want to go as a people, given the reality on the ground. It doesn't take a genius to look at a map and see that it's very hard to achieve the two-state solution within the Oslo paradigm, right? Within the context of bilateral negotiations mediated by the US. And so I don't think anything short of being able to really engage people in Palestine will diminish that apathy. Was there a second component to the question, Laura?
No, I mean, I think that the second part was really whether or not you think annexation on itself will shift maybe even the thinking of PA officials, generate some more energy for the rights-based or some other paradigm itself.
I mean, you would hope so. There's been a recent history of measures of ending security coordination and dissolving the PA and taking drastic measures that send a very strong message to the world about where we are. And there were PLO decisions in 2015 that were quite formal that were never adopted and never executed. So, I mean, we've heard it all before, but we haven't seen the implementation of anything or the pursuit of anything. But again, in what context, in what paradigm are we operating, right? And I think, again, if you look at the reality on the ground, you cannot develop policy as if we're just beginning Madrid, right? We need to develop policy like it is 2022. And that's the biggest failure. That's the biggest cognitive dissonance that exists on this issue.
Terrific, thank you. So turning to Yara, Salah mentioned looking at the map. I want to take us to the map for a second. When people talk about annexation today, they're generally focusing on the West Bank, annexation of land in the West Bank, implications for people in the West Bank, which makes sense because that's where annexation is focused right now. But on the ground, and we're not talking about the diaspora here, I want to make that clear, but on the ground for Palestinians, there are two other integral parts of the Palestinian body politic, and that is residents of the Gaza Strip and Palestinian citizens of Israel, both of whom their interests in the Palestinian political system, self-determination, all of that, are supposed to have been addressed by a two-state solution, right? So that's what sort of put to rest these issues, the issues of self-determination as these groups. So can you talk a little bit about annexation, how it plays with these two different parts of the Palestinian body politic, which are not being talked about at all, and likely responses as even the fig leaf of support for two states is removed.
Yeah, and I think it is important, sometimes the other Palestinian fragments get lost in all of these discussions. In real terms, I want to take us outside a bit of the international law framework, because I think whilst it's a very valid framework, it's also not the only one. In real terms, what does annexation mean for on the ground? It means we're talking about land theft and the absolute control and application of sovereignty, even though that's a very legal term, but the absolute control of a regime over land. And this is something that happens across the Green Line. It doesn't just happen in the West Bank. If you look at 48, what is called Israel proper, you can see that Palestinians are losing their land through very similar mechanisms as how Palestinians lose their land in the West Bank. Take the Naqab, the Negev, for example. Palestinian communities are constantly being displaced and dispersed and being accused of being unrecognized. In other words, the state refuses to recognize their legality as a community or a residential area, and so it uses that basis to destroy those villages. Or it uses their unrecognition to deprive them of basics like running water and electricity, that it makes the living conditions so bad that Palestinian people can no longer live there, and so they are forced to move elsewhere. And this is a common policy across the Naqab, across the Negev Desert. Now, and if you go right to the north as well, into the Galilee, where, may I remind you all, the population is 60% Palestinian citizens of Israel, and this is a great worry for the Israeli regime. They're incredibly worried that there is an area, a huge area of land that does not have a Jewish majority. There are huge efforts that have been underway since the 80s to try and reverse this reality, and one of the ways in which they have been doing it is by taking land. And there are multiple different legal mechanisms which they do so. One is the absentee property law. Others is just through security regulations, confiscation of land deemed too close to the Lebanese border, and so the military can confiscate it. And so you see really Palestinian areas shrinking. And Palestinian villages in the Galilee are completely being surrounded by Jewish Israeli settlements, and so these Palestinian villages cannot expand outwards, they have to expand upwards, and often they don't get building permits to build in these areas. And so you also see a lot of home demolitions, and that's also the case in the Triangle area, in the center area, where there is a huge population of Palestinians. So really, you see Israeli policy continuous across the Green Line, whether we're talking home demolitions, theft of Palestinian land, imprisonment of Palestinian political activists. It's just carried out in very different ways, because of course the Palestinian citizens of Israel have citizenship, although it's not full and fair citizenship. So they carry them out in slightly different mechanisms according to the ruling regime. So when we talk about annexation, I think it's very important that we remember that there has been an annexation of Palestinian land ongoing since 1948, since the establishment of the State of Israel. And all of this, I didn't mention Gaza, and Gaza is often left out of the conversation. And this is something that is incredibly worrying, and it's also part of Israeli policy, is to siphon off Gaza into this ghetto, which they have done successfully, and to fragment them and to detach them from the Palestinian people. When we talk about Palestine now, and even I, fall into this trap, you end up talking just about the West Bank, and not just the West Bank. You end up talking about Areas A, which is such a tiny, tiny percentage of the West Bank. And this is all part of a determined policy by the Israeli regime to cut Gaza off completely from the Palestinian people. And you hear people talking about Palestinians in Gaza as Gazans. Okay, they're Palestinian Gazans. Gaza isn't a separate entity. It's a crucial and vital part of the Palestinian nation, and always will be. So I think it's deliberate policy to leave these constituents out, and it's a successful one, unfortunately.
And just to remind people that under Oslo, Israel agreed to treat the West Bank and Gaza as a single territorial unit. That is stipulated under Oslo. Over to you, Khaled.
Thanks. If I can, I'd like to stay with Yara for a minute, and I want to turn to what all of this means for the future of the Palestinian national movement, the national struggle. So Yara, we've heard a little bit from actually all of you on all the many ways that annexation won't really change that much on the ground, and in some ways might actually be worse. We might see even more restrictions after formal annexation and so forth. But I wanted to pose the question to you, if you've seen Gideon Levy's piece, and also Yoel Zinger wrote a piece over the weekend arguing, oddly enough, that Palestinians should embrace annexation, that annexation might actually be a good thing in the sense that it does away with the pretense that occupation is temporary, that all of this inequality is somehow going to change with this peace process that's, on the horizon, around the corner. What is your take on that view? Is that overly cynical? Is that accurate? Is there a case to be made that maybe this might be a clarifying process?
I did see those pieces you mentioned, and I think it's important to be clear and note that these are actually Palestinian opinions that Palestinians have maintained for a long time. They were just repackaged into a nice Haaretz article. And unfortunately, that happens quite a lot. Palestinians have been saying time and time again things about Israeli expansionism. And unfortunately, we're ignored. And this isn't to play a victimhood, but it's to recognize that structures of power also exist in storytelling and the media and narratives, even among the liberal and the left wing. So it's important to note that. But I think in that argument, there is a lot of validity. We know that the ramifications of official annexation will be very serious indeed. It will mean immediate and mass confiscation and theft of Palestinian land. But it's important to put it within the context that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, which is that of the continuous Nakba. I think formal annexation will simply mean an acceleration of that process. And I've been thinking about this very seriously because I'm actually of the school of thought that I think formal annexation could be a strategic benefit to the Palestinian people. And I've been saying it, thinking about it, how to articulate it in the most responsible way, because of course, I don't live in the Area C or the West Bank, and I'm not one of those most vulnerable Palestinians. But I keep reminding myself that, this land is going to be stolen by Israel. This is Israeli policy. The Israeli regime is an expansionist one, and they will take it, whether it is today, whether it's tomorrow, next week, or next year. This is a continuous process. So I think if we think about it like that, it's not a defeatist attitude. It certainly isn't. It's rather one that acknowledges the reality of de facto annexation, a reality that unfortunately has seemed to invoke very little tangible reaction from the international community. And so that's why I think it might actually be a game changer. It will no longer allow third parties to maintain that the occupation is temporary, or that there is some kind of red line that Israel will cross that will invoke some kind of response. And I also think it places the validity of the international legal regime front and center. And I think a lot of people are also asking the question, or they're saying, formal annexation will mean creeping apartheid. And that's also something that I don't agree with. I don't think it means creeping apartheid. I think we already live in apartheid reality. And I think that's something that's very difficult for a lot of people to get their head around, because it questions the very foundations of the state of Israel. The apartheid regime started in 1948, ironically, the same year that it was institutionalized in South Africa. Now, if you look at all the legislation that was brought in mind then, that was brought and established then, the division of land, I say division as if it was a fair process, the theft of land, of resources, the segregation of the Palestinian population that survived the ethnic cleansing in 48, all of this laid out in the basic laws of Israel. This was all the foundations for an apartheid regime. Now, that apartheid regime in 1967 was simply lifted to expand over to the occupied territories and enforced through a military occupation. So I think this is something that's very difficult for a lot of liberals to grasp, that we have been in an apartheid regime since 1948.
Great. And do you see it playing a role in terms of changing the way the leadership looks at a solution, for example, or will it trigger some sort of groundswell at the grassroots level to influence their leaders that maybe we need now is the time to change frameworks?
So when you say leadership, I presume you mean the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah, the leadership such as it is that currently exists. Frankly, whether we're talking about the PA in the West Bank or Hamas in Gaza, or even the remnants of whatever might be called the PLO, those institutions of leadership. Do you see a way that will this accelerate changes at the political level? That yes, now it's time to formally abandon the two-state framework and move on to something else?
I don't see it happening at the PA level, because I think abandoning the two-state framework means self-extinguishing itself. And most people in the PA are not interested in extinguishing themselves or their positions or their power. So unfortunately, I don't see it happening at that level. I do see an opportunity, a very small opportunity for the revival of the PLO through popular demand, but I don't think formal annexation is going to lead to a sort of mass popular protest, because of all the things that we've mentioned, that this has already been continuing. It's the same with when Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem. People were expecting a lot, another intifada, but and there was bloodshed, and Palestinians were killed on that day. We can't forget that, but these are things that already happened, or already in process. It's the international community that's waking up when it happens, and they're like, oh, the Palestinians must be waking up as well. But the Palestinians have always been awake. Unfortunately, the leadership perhaps has not. So I think it's going to take a lot, but this is a very prime opportunity for Palestinians to think about what they want from their leadership and for a change in strategy. I don't think it's going to come from the top, because it means a serious rethinking, let's say, about their positions and their power. So I think it will have to come from the bottom, but I don't think formal annexation will necessarily do what perhaps you're suggesting.
Great, thanks for that. Rania, I want to ask you maybe to unpack a little bit of when you talked about some of the legal tools that might become available to Palestinians, or more attractive to Palestinians, or even to the international community. Could you unpack those for us? Obviously, there's the existing case before the ICC. Could you talk a little bit about that? What other types of legal action can be taken? The PA's, made some noises about possibly suing the U.S. government. Not really sure on what grounds that would happen, or that they would even have the political will. But could you lay out for us sort of what are the menu of possibilities of possible legal tools that can be used, even without formal annexation, but quite simply even in this, just given the status quo?
Sure, of course. Maybe the first thing I will start with is definitely the ICC. You've already mentioned it, but the International Criminal Court does have jurisdiction over the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, and that means that acts of annexation, which actually give rise to individual criminal responsibility, would be prosecutable at the ICC, and that's something important for us to remember. The ICC, obviously, the process before the ICC is ongoing, but late last year, the prosecutor announced that she would be opening an investigation into the situation in Palestine, and I think that that's very relevant to the context at hand right now. 2 years ago, when there were discussions about, for example, the forced eviction of Khan al-Ahmar, at the time there was still a preliminary examination in Palestine, but the prosecutor still already said that that would constitute a war crime. Now there actually is an investigation that has been opened by the ICC, and that's very relevant to our context, because when we talk about acquisition of territory by force, forcible transfer of populations, destruction of property, all of these amount to crimes under the Rome Statute, and therefore they can be prosecuted. And so it's important, I think, also to recall now that the prosecutor just recently, on the 30th of April, actually submitted a response to submissions from states, civil society, and academics to the court. And in her response, again, she confirmed the territorial jurisdiction of the court, which encompasses the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And basically now we're waiting for confirmation from the pre-trial chamber of the court to also confirm this jurisdiction. So yes, the process is slightly slow, or very slow, because it has been 5 years since the ratification of the Rome Statute by the state of Palestine. But this is definitely an avenue, and it's an important one when it comes to accountability for those responsible for carrying out annexation and planning annexation. When it comes to other mechanisms, there are other mechanisms, as you mentioned. I mean, you talked about, for example, suing the US government for annexation. The PA has also talked about filing lawsuits against international companies, for example, that are operating in Israeli settlements. But I don't think that this is enough, because we really here do have to focus on the responsibility of third states that so far have not taken the measures that would have prevented this in the first place. I'll give one example from a resolution that was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1982. That resolution was adopted following Israel's adoption of a basic law in which it extended its sovereignty and legislation to the occupied Syrian Golan, after, of course, it had done the same thing with Jerusalem. And in 82, a resolution was supposed to be adopted by the Security Council to adopt sanctions, and that, of course, failed because of a US veto again. And therefore, the resolution was transferred to the General Assembly for consideration. And the General Assembly actually at the time adopted a very strong worded resolution in which it talked about, and in which it really outlined measures that third states should be taking, and that would actually be coercive measures that could put an end to the illegal situation. Amongst the things that the resolution really highlighted was, for example, refraining from supplying Israel with weapons and related military equipment, and suspending any military assistance to Israel. The other thing that the resolution stipulated was to suspend economic, financial, and technological assistance to Israel. And the last one was to sever diplomatic, trade, and cultural relations. And this is a resolution that was binding on all member states and that imposed these measures on all states of the UN. And on the last point that I do also really want to highlight, and this ties back to what Yara was saying, is I think that it's also time to recognize with the current situation that we have been living for a while and for a long time now in an apartheid system that is imposed over all Palestinians. And we have heard here and there comments saying that annexation would be apartheid in the making, but that really is not accurate. Apartheid is already in place on the ground right now, and it has been for decades, especially with the laws that Yara already mentioned, which form the foundation of the state of Israel. And so we do need a recognition from states that there is an apartheid regime over all Palestinians, which really wouldn't change, but was already on the ground and would only be further entrenched with formal annexation. There actually is already a country in the United Nations that recognizes Israel as an apartheid regime, and that's South Africa, which I think speaks volumes as well. They are one of the countries in the Human Rights Council calling Israel an apartheid regime and calling for the dismantling of that apartheid system over Palestinians. And there are two mechanisms that existed at the time in the UN, and I think we should be really considering them today. Again, it's the UN Center Against Apartheid and the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid. And we're calling definitely for their reconstitution to put an end to the system of apartheid in the 21st century. So these are really two examples that exist. And in a recent statement, actually, by the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, he also said very clearly that further annexation would only crystallize an apartheid system in the 21st century, and that legally, politically, and morally, this is entirely unacceptable.
Thanks, Rania. I should point out that we're just about out of time. We officially have about a minute left, but I do want to turn to Salem, and I'm afraid that will probably have to be the last word. Salem, in terms of Palestinian activism and solidarity work around the world, we've seen the many challenges posed by anti-BDS laws and attempts to criminalize or prohibit speech that could be critical of Israel in various forms. What do you see as the future of organizing? Is it likely to change? Will annexation have an impact on solidarity work at the grassroots level? And what will it look like? Will it change what Palestinians are demanding, or will it simply mean that others will be more receptive to hearing them?
And Saddam, feel free to take more than a minute to respond.
Thanks,
We'll keep this
You're
going.
very generous, Lara. You're very generous. Thank you. Khaled, that's a very good question. I think there's an absolute phenomenon of shrinking space. The one we're feeling at home in Palestine is also extended to around the world. And so you have smear campaigns, you have attacks, you have the cynical weaponization of the fight against anti-Semitism that is used to completely shut down all forms of Palestinian advocacy, right? Whether it is BDS or other forms. And that you see that with anti-BDS laws in US states, you see that with resolutions coming out of Congress, you see that in European countries. I mean, in Germany, it's as bad as you can't rent a space to hold a Palestinian film night. I mean, this is how bad it's become, right? And so anything that's synonymous with Palestinian is immediately made radioactive. And that's kind of the environment we're currently operating with around the world. And this is a very well-mounted, well-funded campaign that is emanating from the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Jerusalem and a lot of its allies around the world. And for them, the strategy is to delegitimize the delegitimizers of Israel, right? And that's what they're trying to do. So there are those challenges, but I also like to argue that there are a lot of historic opportunities. And I think with annexation the formal annexation, the facades of the Oslo paradigm, and there's no partner for peace, and the Palestinians are not interested in many things. The list is long. The Palestinians never miss an opportunity. Those whole talking points no longer stand, I think, with any merit to anyone that can look at the facts, right? And so it's very much harder to do that. And the other thing is political tribes around the world are being redefined. And we live in an extremely polarized world, and support is now underpinned by certain values. You have the forces that support fascism, ethno-nationalism, inclusive society, surveillance, walls, etc. I mean, there are many. There's Orban, Trump, Marie Le Pen, Nigel Farage, even Boris Johnson, etc. And that they align with Netanyahu, and a lot of them hold Israel to be a model state because it's an ethnocentric regime that has been able to suppress people for very long. And so now it's very easy to explain to people around the world that, look, this is the type of entity you're supporting, right? And I think intrinsically within I think the aspiration of the Palestinian people are values that are the antithesis of those forces. The struggle for freedom, the struggle for justice, the struggle for equality and rights for all. And so when you explain to many, and there's attempts to reach out to movements all around the world that hold these values to be their own, it's harder to remain progressive except for Palestinian anymore, right? And with the access to information, I think with populations all around the world becoming more ethnically diverse, caring more about social justice issues, it's easier to relate. And so it's about then how do we as Palestinians able to communicate with the rest of the world based on those values? And I think that's where we begin the conversation. I mean, the conversation's been going for a long time, but those are the means, and that's the language we have to speak. And on a strategic level, that fits in more so within the paradigm of a one-state reality in an apartheid system where you have one ethnicity maintaining supremacy over another, and your basic freedoms or rights are afforded to you based on your ethnicity rather than anything else. And that is a very powerful thing, So I think there's a lot of opportunities to build solidarity. And if we want to go to the fundamental regression why it's needed, there's an asymmetry of power between us and the Israeli occupation and the Israeli apartheid regime. And since the inception of our national movement, we require global solidarity to stand with us to be able to pursue freedom and rights. And so I think over the long run, we have so many more opportunities to tap into these communities, to also tap into the 7 million Palestinians that live outside Palestine and be able to bring them back in language and policies and visions that are also inclusive. So the opportunities are great, but also the challenges are also quite dangerous. And I think we're going to have to navigate them in a very polarized world, where I think the values you hold determine the political positions you hold on this issue, more so than ever.
Thank you very much, Salim, and thank you to all of our panelists. On behalf of the Foundation for Middle East Peace and the Middle East Institute, we have to wind up this terrific conversation. I wish we could go another hour at least. And thank you to all the people who submitted questions. As I said in the chat box, we will be giving those questions in writing to all of our panelists to help them guide their own thinking, to help them know what people are interested in. For everyone, if you want to learn more about the issues we've been discussing today, you can follow our panelists on Twitter or at their websites. That was in the chat box. You can find more information on our website, fmep.org or mei.edu. And finally, I want to note again, this is part 2 of a 3-part webinar. The 3rd part will be Monday, looking at Israeli perspectives, and you can register for that online at the same place where you registered for today's webinar. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, our participants, and with that, we will close.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you all.